Greetings, Tansai, Notatumtik, Harlan, Pruden, Ewaka, no Mani, Nehiyô, 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 Cree. Greetings, my relatives. Why won't this paste? Oh, I guess because I haven't moved my browser. Okay, I will do this in a little bit. My government name is Harlan Pruden, and my Indian name, and I use the I word. You can ask me why I use the I word later in the chit chat. Is Wakant No Mani. It's actually in Sioux. I was doing some work on the Rosebud Reservation, and they honored me with the name Wakant No Mani. Wakant being spirit, good spirit, bad spirit, neutral spirit. I can do good just as well as I can do bad, or I can like suck up a lot of space and do absolutely nothing. And so that part of my name is a responsibility of how do I want to show up. So I try to show up with good actions, good words, and good thoughts. I try my best. And when I make a mistake is only a mistake if we don't learn from it. And so it becomes a learning opportunity. Nom is two, and Mani is a sacred journey. And so I was going to try to get that translated into Cree. I am First Nations Cree, or Nehiyô in my language. And my mother is from the Beaver Lake Indian Reserve. My father is from the Saddle Lake Indian Reserve. Two different reservations, but they're both signatories to Treaty 6 territory. And I also said that I am Two-Spirit in my own language, which is what we'll be talking about today. And let's try this. Okay, can you tell me whether or not you see the whole slide? Yes, or do you see my presentation mode?
We can see the presentation mode. Sorry, Sharon.
Okay, let me try this again. Stop share. Let's try this, and there we go.
Perfect.
How's that?
Excellent.
Okay, and my other name today is going to be Motormouth Mabel, and that's because I have so much information that I want to share with you. Really, so I'll just be going through it, okay? But if I am speaking way too fast, just jump in at any time and tell me to like pump the brakes, all right? One, I would like to thank KT Canada. I would like to thank Megan, who I've been working with, and also for that lovely introduction and warm introduction, Sharon. And also all of the other folks over at KT Canada. So we'll be talking about Two-Spirit and health research, collecting as well as handling or managing Two-Spirit data in a culturally affirming way or ways, all right? Before I go any further, I wish to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional, unceded, and ancestral territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh Nation. I am so gracious to my hosts for tolerating my presence in and on their territory as well as their homes. Finally, I also would like to thank you all for joining me today to just talk about Two-Spirit data and Two-Spirit and health research. Now, let's talk about 530 years of colonization. This year, 2021 marks about 530 years of colonization. This is a painting that was done by Kent Monkman, and I don't know whether or not it's still hanging up in the Grand Hall of the Metropolitan Museum, but Kent is this amazing Two-Spirit artist, and Kent has this alter ego. That's the individual with the red sash looking at hand outreach and looking right at us, called Miss Eagle Testicle. No, Mischief Eagle Testicle is the name of the alter ego. If you don't know Kent's work, I would highly encourage you to do a little bit of research on him because he's an amazing artist. Now, for revisiting our past, I would like to start off with this picture of the first Indian residential school. This picture is the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. It opened in 1879, closed in 1918. And although this is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, Duncan Scott, under the direction of J.A. McDonald, went down, studied and looked at this, and then came back and replicated this entire system within Canada. This one school had about 100,000 Native children that went through its doors from 1879 to 1918 when it closed. From approximately 140 different nations, the kids that went through this. Just a really kind of fun fact. Do you know how many kids graduated from this one school of 100,000? 158. That was a graduation rate of 0.158%. We can be generative and round it up to 0.2%. And with that graduation rate, it was still hailed as some huge success. It's where we get the beautiful statement, or the kill the Indian to save the man, or another word that shows up in the archive is the noble experiment, which was the failed attempt to forcibly assimilate Native American children into the culture of the United States. And of course, it should be noted that this is a picture and an image from the US Army, as this was housed within the Department of War. Now, another part of like revisiting our past is that here in Canada, in 1928, sterilization begins. The Alberta legislature passes the Sexual Sterilization Act under the auspices of eugenics. And where do they go? They go right to residential schools to prevent them from giving Native children or Native folks from giving birth. And that legislation was repealed only in 1972. So that's in my lifetime, and it's in many of our lifetimes. And if it's not in your lifetime, it's in your parents' lifetime. Now, the only other province in Canada that had a similar sort of legislation is here in BC, in British Columbia. And in the passage of 1933 piece of legislation, and sterilization begins here. And again, that was repealed only in 1973. Now, I assumed just really, really wrongly that it was just looking at our female assigned individuals for sterilization. And what I found was this historical document from the University of Lethbridge that looked at the notes and the decisions from the sterilization board, the board composed of 3 individuals who were not Indigenous. And although the names were redacted, there was these serial numbers and then the actual determination. And what I found was interesting in that it was like tubal ligation, bisectomy, tubal ligation, from this one meeting and this one the determination of the board. And so both our male assigned as well as our female assigned individuals were sterilized under both of these acts. Now, a similar sort of experience happened within the United States in the US context. And this is, I'm speaking for Russell, my US relative who is joining us today. Indian Health Services, that was formed in 1955 within the Department of Health and Education and Welfare. From the 60s, about 70,000 Native American women, and this is primarily women, from the 60s into the 70s, were sterilized. It's also really interesting because if you look at the 70s, it was the rise of feminism. And so although there was this like attentiveness for equality and equity for women, there was a whole class of women that were being sterilized that were absent from that conversation, as well as that work. And so I just want to draw that out. Research and what brings us here today. Here in Canada, under the Department of Indian Affairs of Canada, unethical nutritional experiments were performed on Canadian Aboriginal children in 6 residential schools for about a decade, 1942 to 1952. Dr. Percy Moore, Dr. Frederick Tisdale were 2 famed researchers, and one of them was a nutritionalist, and their experiments on these residential school children, parents were not informed, and nor were there any consents Now you can say, okay, bless their hearts, right? Perhaps they didn't know, right? Well, this was post the Nuremberg trial and what we saw with like Dr. Mengele and some of the unethical and human trials that were done. They knew. So it's important that we talk about Dr. Percy, and we name Dr. Percy and Dr. Frederick Tisdale, who starved Native American children, or sorry, Indigenous children to death, and how that research was used to inform the Canadian Nutritional Guide. Similar sort of another example. These are just two small little examples. I could probably do an entire presentation on just from this one slide. Of the US forces of the Arctic Aeromedical Laboratory that attempted to identify the role of the thyroid gland with human acclimatization. And what they did was they went to Alaska and they injected our native elders with radioactive isotopes to knock out their thyroids to see how they dealt with the cold weather. Now, why do I start there? Education, law, policy, and research. I start with those things in that these are often positioned as noble institutions, that we are members of the research or the Academy of Research or the Academy of Education or law. And what I'm trying to draw attention to is that there is this history in which that those positioned noble institutions are handmaidens, are how we as Indigenous people view them as handmaidens of colonization. And I think reconciliation calls us to revisit these pasts so that we may learn that work, that truth, and then we reconcile that with today so that we try to get in better relations with Indigenous people as representatives of members of these noble or positioned noble institutions, education, law, and also research. All right, that's it for colonization. Let's talk about TwoSpirit. So the concept of TwoSpirit, so this is the closest that you're going to get to a definition of what and who TwoSpirit is. It's basically a framing or a framework to understand what and who TwoSpirit is. First of all, TwoSpirit is a community organizing tool and not an identity. Identity we'll unpack that in a little bit. TwoSpirit doesn't make sense unless it's contextualized within an Indigenous framework or community. Within a traditional setting, TwoSpirit was a gender analysis as opposed to a sexual orientation analysis. Some nations had 2 genders, while other nations had 3, some had 4, others had 5, 6, 7. A nation had 12 different genders. How do we conceive of a world that has more than 2 genders or a Western understanding of the gender binary? Today, most people associate the term with lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, questioning, intersex, and the list can go on and on. Indigenous people. However, the work of TwoSpirit organization, leaders, elders, and community members is more akin to this traditional understanding of who were we within a pre-contact setting, and what is the application and the relevancy of those teachings and ways for today's individuals. Now, where did TwoSpirit come from? So those nations that had a TwoSpirit tradition and ways, we had our own words within our own languages that named, accounted, and defined our TwoSpirit relatives. At the beginning of this talk is I identified and I said that I am TwoSpirit, Niha Ayakwe. And Ayakwe is in Cree, it would be my gender. I wouldn't say that I am a man, Napwe, nor would I say I was a woman, Squea. I would say that I was a Yakwe. And so we will go through a little of those words in the coming slides. But I put 1492. It wasn't 1492. 1492 is a big year for us, right? Because that's when CC shows up on the shores of the territory of the land that we would call Hispaniola. In October 11th, I think, 1492, CC puts their flag down for Spain and says, ha ha, I've discovered you. We're like, oh, thank goodness, right? Here we are just lost, rambling around on our big old continent, right? And thank goodness you have found and discovered us, right? That's important framing. And I think that as researchers, I think is there different frameworks and different ways of looking at the reality? In that for Indigenous people, the way that we tell that story, and many of us do, is on October 11th, 1492, the Indigenous people of Hispaniola, they woke up and they discovered CC on their shores. Both realities are true, but do we give weight and primacy over one at the expense of the other? So 1492 to around 1989, 1990, the term berdache was used. Now, berdache is this French word, and it's not a pretty word because it's rooted within this Persian word, barja. It was spread throughout Europe and shows up first in Italian, bardasso, then Spanish, bardaxa. And in the early 16th century, about 1525, it shows up in French. These French missionaries were wandering around Turtle Island and they saw these individuals that were like maybe male assigned and hanging out and doing the work of women, and female assigned individuals that were hanging out and doing the work of men. And they're like, this doesn't fit into my rigid binary gender system in which that they're only men and women. They're like, what do we call them? What do we call them? They're like, what's that Persian word that showed up in Italian and Spanish? So what they did was they translated into French as berdache. But if we go back to that Persian word and we look at the translation, it translates into a young man or boy who serves as another's succubus. Y'all have to Google that word because it's a nut bar word, okay? Succubus. Permitting sodomy to be committed upon him or a passive homosexual partner. What they're narrowly defining and what they're saying is that it is the anal male receptive partner is who they would classify as berdache. But starting in 1975 with in the Bay Area, Randy Burns, Barbara Cameron, and other leaders TwoSpirit folks came together. No, it was before TwoSpirit. Other Indigenous gay and lesbian folks came together. And there was this beginning of this like consciousness, first of all, organizing and then discussions of who were we and what is our history. And that culminated at the 1990 gathering of the Basket and Bow gathering of gay and lesbian Native Americans. And at that gathering that happened outside of Winnipeg, the attendees said, we hate this word berdache. One, it's not honoring or inclusive of our Two-Spirit sisters. It's base, it has to do with sex, and it's about a particular role within sex. And for a whole host of reasons, they dismissed the term. But then they were like, but how do we then organize? And after many, many rounds and much discussions, the attendees came up with the term Two-Spirit. They wanted a term that reflected both a combination of both masculinity and femininity, hi Estella, that attributed to males and feminine roles and females in masculine roles. And there we have a pivot. The pivot was around your role, i.e. gender, and it was away from sexual orientation. So that is where the genesis and the beginning of that conversation. Now, it's also incredibly important to note that it was political, in that the community was like saying, hey, you missionaries, you members of the academy that are studying us, and like, you have no right to name us. That right belongs to us. And we choose Two-Spirit. Now, the academy was a little bit flummoxed. They were like, you can't change terms. And the community was like, yeah, we can change terms, right? So if you see the term berdache in any sort of text, the scholarship may hold true, but the word we find highly offensive. And so I would encourage you to take a pen, cross it out, and write Two-Spirit, in that the scholarship and the research may hold true, but the term we do not use. Now, how do we conceive of a world that has more than two genders? Okay, so if I were to make you all a part of the Cree nation, first of all, how does it feel to be a member of the best nation in the whole wide world? I jest. For the Cree folks is that we had two big dominant camps or two big dominant societies. We had the men's camp that hunted, and we had the women's camp that gathered. Now, of course, there was a lot more to their work. I'm just distilling it down to hunting and gathering, right? Also, the way that us Crees worked is that a man was never allowed in a woman's camp, and a woman was never allowed in a man's camp. Was that good? Was that bad? Well, we can suspend that. That's just how our society is formed. And also within that division of labor, there was also, they spoke different languages. They spoke a technical language, no different from our technical language of like research, like when we say ontology or epistemology, what's methodology. They had a woman's language that was a technical language, and they had a men's language that was around hunting and around their work of gathering. So if there was ever imbalance or disharmony amongst these two camps, a man couldn't walk over to the woman's camp and say, hey, woman, what's going on? And a woman couldn't walk over to the man's camp and say, hey, man, what's going on? But us as a Yahweh, we had unfettered and equal access to both camps. We also were schooled often in both of the techne of hunting, techne of gathering, and we were also schooled in the intricacies of your technical language. And so if there was ever imbalance or disharmony, us as a Yahweh could float over to the women's camp and be like, hey, women, what's going on? What's happening, right? Float over to the men's camp and we're like, hey, man, what's going on? And we could go back and forth, and we could mediate and bring balance or harmony or conflict resolution amongst these two camps. A woman couldn't do this, a man couldn't do this, but just as a Yahweh could do this. So a different way of thinking about that is men hunting, women gathering, a Yahweh mediating the spaces between those two camps. We just had a different role. And so for those nations that had 12 genders, they had 12 distinct camps or societies, all performing different roles that no other gender could perform or could do. Now, if I were Sioux, there wouldn't be a social expect. I would be known as on a wink day rather than a Yahweh. And there wouldn't be a social expectation of me being a mediator, but there would be a social expectation that I would be the officiant of a naming ceremony. So the whole takeaway from this slide is that Two-Spirit is going to mean something different and have different roles and responsibilities and societal expectations, depending on what nation you're from and a member of. So if you're Anishinaabe or Ojibwe, you'll have a different expectation. If you're Mojave, you'll have a different expectation. That's why Two-Spirit cannot be an identity, an endpoint of sorts, that it's going to mean something different culturally for each nation and each member. Now, I've collected about 130 terms and built upon the work of Willie Roscoe, where he was working with Barbara and Randy of the Bay Area Gay American Indian Organization. I'm going to make up the Cree entry was validated by 21 Cree speakers. I'm going to buzz through these. The bolded ones and the bolded entries are entries that I have been working on and or have worked on. For the Nicholnath one, there's a little sadness in that I did this talk, and Lillian Howard, who just transitioned to the spirit realm about 10 days ago, when she heard this talk and she saw these words and she came to me with tears in her eyes. And she said, I really wish that my relative would have known of these words. These words have not, the Nicholnath words, it's been probably about 75 years since they've been shared in a public sphere. Would have known of these words before they took their lives. Gwasala, another BC First Nations community. And those words also, it's been a generation since that word has been seen in a public sphere. Right now, I'm working with the Stolo Nation to get the Stolo words. So these words are so incredibly important. For where there's a word, there's a story, but more importantly, thank you very much, Mita. She was really, really special. Where there's a word, there's a story. Where there's a word, there's a history. But more importantly, where there's a word, there is a people. And so how TwoSpirit works is that we organize. We're like, hey, TwoSpirit community, we're doing a powwow or an event. And if the individual shows up and they're male assigned and Zuni, what we do is we gift them their word, lahamana, and a framework in which that we can understand for them to begin that inquiry of what does it mean to be lahamana, who is lahamana, and what is my role and purpose as a lahamana for my Zuni people, and calls them back home and roots and centers their ingenuity. In absence of these words, as well as a framework, often our LGBT, queer, questioning, intersect, and the list goes on, Indigenous people think they have to make a choice between being queer and being an Indian. And what wins? Often their queer identity. They run off to an urban setting where they join the queer community, right? Only to come back, and where we do is we provide the word as well as the framework and calls them back home. And so I think that's the medicine of these words, as well as the power of these words, as well as the teachings. Now, we're not alone. If you look at other Indigenous communities outside of Turtle Island or North America, you have the Hijra in India and Bulbul in Pakistan. You have the Mahu in Hawaii, the Fa'afafine in Samoa, and this list is by no means complete. Although we wouldn't use TwoSpirit, but it fits very comfortable within this framing of a non-binary gender understanding and framing that existed in many Indigenous communities across the world. And back to now, this all changed, and so pivoting back to the residential boarding school experiment and the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. So what does this have to do with doing TwoSpirit? Well, this has everything, and this has nothing to do with being TwoSpirit. You're like, hold up, that sounds contradictory, right? Well, no, like if we deconstruct and look at the subject matter of this picture, we see all, I'm going to make some assumptions, all of the male assigned individuals with short hair that are all wearing pants and wearing a little coat. All of the, I'm assuming, female assigned individuals have longish hair and are all wearing dresses and skirts. It is, and where they're conceived as young girls or women, young women and girls, and young men and boys. It is that imposition of that rigid binary gender system that was imposed on us as Indigenous people. Gone are the third, the fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, even 12 different genders, leaving room for only their two genders. If you want to talk about conversion therapy, this was conversion therapy for us as TwoSpirit people. Now, who were some of our people, our TwoSpirit people of long ago? So this is, there's only about 20 known historical images of our TwoSpirit relatives. And so you're probably seeing about 60, 65% of the known universe right now. The image right in the middle with the two individuals wearing war bonnets, that's one of the only Canadian examples that we have. When I have like 3 minutes, the BC archive has some Nuu-chulnmuth pictures, and we think that we have some TwoSpirit relatives from the Nuu-chulnmuth Nation. It's also incredibly important that most of these pictures are male assigned, except for the ones on your top right side, and the etching are female pictures of our female TwoSpirit relatives. I put myself in the archive. This is a picture when I was 5. Okay, and my fly is open. I always want to point that out because I don't want people to think, why is he showing a picture with his fly open? So I draw attention to it myself. All right, now I want to talk with a little bit of our balance of our time of like, what are those, and I know I did a really big overview of what and who TwoSpirit is. And so what I would like to do is just pivot to the work of the TwoSpirit Dry Lab to talk about the relevancy of those teachings and ways as it plays out in research. So I've been blessed and honored to be one of the co-founders of the TwoSpirit Dry Lab. The TwoSpirit Dry Lab is Turtle Island's first ever research group or lab that solely focuses on TwoSpirit experiences, peoples, as well as communities. It is an initiative of Indigenous and settler researchers, community leaders engaged in research at the intersection of ingenuity, gender, sexual orientation, geography, that works to promote best practices in sex and gender science and to grow new knowledges that can be applied to improve our outcomes. Now, this is only half of the lab. Here's the other half. And Teddy is honored, she has joined us today. And Teddy was like, I don't want my picture. And I was like, what can we use? And Teddy was like, I just use a kitten. So I typed in cutest kitten, and this is what yielded. So that's not, we don't have a kitty cat. We actually have a camera shy lab member. Now, additionally, for the TwoSpirit Dry Lab, we also have a capacity building function to promote the understandings of best and wise practices for Indigenous and TwoSpirit research, as well as a discovery function through the analysis and continuous learning and engagement with and for TwoSpirit community members. So the lab, which we got a CIHR grant through the Indigenous and Gender Wellness Initiative, is we've hired 2 peer researchers to assist the lab, Matthew Fisher, who is Mi'kmaq, and Zaylee Bouchamp, who is Mohawk. Now, most labs, when they come together, it's about the what, outcome driven, right? And although we are outcome driven, there is this great attentiveness of how do we work, because we are Indigenous and we're relationship driven. My relative, Evelyn Steinhauer from the University of Alberta says, for us as Crees, and this kind of, I think, holds true for many Indigenous communities, is that all knowledge is relational. And that without relationship, there is no possibility of knowledge for us. And so the importance is on process and how. And so how we work is the centering of Indigenous ways of being. We are transdisciplinary or multidisciplinary of Indigenous and non-Indigenous epidemiologists, knowledge translation leads, sociologists, researchers, community members, and the list can go on and on. We also make a best effort of looking at Indigenous methodologies and approaches. We take a 2-eyed seeing approach, which is a beautiful teaching from a Mi'kmaq elder, Marshall, where from one eye, we see some of the good things around colonization and Western ontologies and ways of being. And from the other eye, we see the goodness and the richness of Indigenous ontologies and ways of being, right? And what we do is we hold them both up at the same time, and we don't play them off one another. What we try to do is to build upon and put them in concert with one another. Kind of sounds like us being TwoSpirit, right? And bouncing between 2 different camps. So we take a little spin on that. We call it TwoSpirit eyed seeing approach to our work. All of our meetings and work are done in the circle, meaning that it is collaboratively, non-hierarchical, where we don't have a leader. It's a decentralized leadership. And there is a best effort for consensus decision-making with the aim or requirement of acceptance of all members of the lab. And this is incredibly important, because if we get someplace and a lab member is not there with us, it's a failure. But if we arrive someplace and all of the lab members are there and there's still love in our hearts, and we're honoring of that sacred space that dwells between and within all of us as lab members, as well as with the relationship with the community, that wherever we land, it'll be a good place. And so the how is really important, as opposed to the what. The what is important. But if we know that, if that attentiveness of how do we get together and how are we honoring and mindful of each other. Now, we primarily have been working from the Sex Now survey, which is one of Canada's largest and longest running national periodic survey for gay, bi, trans, two-spirit, and queer men here in Canada. And right now we have been working from the 2015 Sex Now data, which was one of the 10, 12, and 15 were the first national surveys across Canada. So we've been working with a national data data set. As a result of our engagement and work with the 2015 data set, we revised and offered some recommendations to the 2018 in-person survey, as well as the 2019 survey, to better capture health-related and experiential knowledge of Indigenous participants. So how did that guidance look like? I'm just going to give you a little peek. So in 2015, in Q1, we asked, what was your gender identity? And we offered as a variable, two-spirit. And then we said, you know, how do you describe your sexual identity? And again, two-spirit was offered. And then we also asked what the cultural and ethnic origins and Aboriginal. So when the lab came together, and this is like Teddy was instrumental in pulling this data. The results was about 4.5 of the overall national survey sample were Aboriginal, giving us an N value of 363. And then we're like, how many folks used two-spirit, selected two-spirit in either Q1 or Q2? And we had 156 people select two-spirit. But then Teddy was like, how many were Aboriginal? And so when we crossed tab Q1, Q2 with Q70, 62% of the two-spirit respondents were not Aboriginal. So we blew them out of our work, and we only looked at whether or not people who selected Aboriginal, and then all of the other identities, including two-spirit, and that became our overall sample size of 363. So we were like, we can do better. And so we came up with this way of collecting the two-spirit data. And what we did was we made the recommendation for the 2018 in-person survey. And so you can see for this question was, which of the following best describes you? And then so an individual had to select Indigenous. Then they had to say whether or not that they were First Nations, Métis, Inuit, prefer to self-describe, and prefer not to say. Sometimes it's not safe to say. And then and only then did you get the question of, are you two-spirit, yes or no? And the results of that was that for the 2018, about 9% of the overall sample, the national sample, were Indigenous, giving us a sample size of 314. But 60% were First Nations, 40% were Métis, and 3% were Inuk, which is kind of cool because that kind of marries and mirrors, I didn't say marries, I said mirrors, the national data of Indigenous, that breakdown of 60-43%, which is kind of cool, right? 42% of the Indigenous respondents identified as two-spirit. They said yes. And that's cool, right? Because not everyone knows what two-spirit is. And even if you do know, you may not use it. So that's kind of cool. And 0% of the respondents were not Indigenous. I was trying to get that link. I will send the link once we go to the conversation of the actual guidance of the for the meet the methods. This one. Also, the way in which that we structured the survey instrument is we asked this question up front, this demographic information up front. But then what we did was we had sexual identity and gender identity later on in the survey. And why we did that was like, okay, so I am two-spirit. I talk to you as a two-spirit community organizer here, but I'm also a gay man, like gay and a man, you know, sexual orientation as well as my gender identity. And so it gives me the option, because I've honored how I conceive of myself within my Indigenous framework, our understanding. What I then can do is I'm given the option to honor how am I showing up in the Western world as a gay man. Now, I'm also given the option that I could write in Two-Spirit, or I could say that my gender identity is Two-Spirit. I could write that in, or I could say I'm a man or non-binary. Also, the other thing that we did within the survey is that we offered responses where the community could see themselves within the survey instrument. So in the past year, which of the following resources have you gone to? Now, prior to our guidance, it was like psychiatrist, registered counselor, social worker, right? And what we did was we offered options for our Indigenous people. And we said these are only open for Indigenous respondents of like an elder or a knowledge keeper or ceremony. And these are like, and so we get a lot more robust and a fleshing out options, but more importantly is that the community sees themselves within the Indigenous, within the survey instrument. Now I know like folks want to say, let's get a cab, right? Or like, I don't have, like, how am I supposed to work so that the survey instrument, well, my best and recommendation is that to get an Indigenous person a part of your research team, not as a cab, advise, but someone within a leadership position and their support so that they can go through and look at the survey instrument to make sure that the community sees themselves within your research project. Now, let's talk about decolonizing research. Okay, I gotta talk really fast now, right? And this, I have to like thank Teddy for helping and assisting with this next part of the work. So Apple says, hey, we're both fruit, we grow on trees, we're both round, that must make us the same, right? And the orange goes, sorry, Noodle, no, we are very different, right? So you would know that as like the testing or the null hypothesis, where we assume two groups have no differences. And by showing that there's a difference, further analysis is warranted, resulting in innumerable and ad nauseum studies that establish that the health indicators of Indigenous people, in our example, is differ from non-Indigenous counterparts. By contributing no further to knowledge, but merely rehashing what is already known, that we are different. And by accepting these differences exist, we acknowledge that health inequities exist while simultaneously freeing ourselves to look at the strengths within the community rather than just the deficiencies that rejecting the null hypothesis allows. So let's unpack all of that because this is incredibly important. When Travis and I, as well as other members of the TwoSpirit Dry Lab, when we came together, we agreed that we did not want to do a type of research in which that there is this, often research is this national data set. We extract a subpopulation, Indigenous in our case, and we do this compare and contrast. One, is that a fair comparison? Like, I have been born Nehiyô, I'm going to die Nehiyô. Why should I be compared to non-Nehiyô? And then what are we actually saying, right? Often, because we're in our minority and because of structural issues, is that we're often in a less than position. We talk about deficiencies. And so I was like, I want to be a part of a research group, but I do not want to stand in front of my Indigenous and Two-Spirit community and say, hey, Two-Spirit and Indigenous community, you're going to get HIV more than white people. You're going to die younger. You're going to have less education, thereby less opportunities, less money. And what I'm doing is that type of scholarship and research is that I would be standing in front of my community and saying you're less than or you're worse off. Now, if there's a non-Nehiyô sitting in the audience, they hear in the void, wow, I'm not going to get HIV as much as the Indians. I'm going to have better education, more opportunities, a better life. I'm going to live longer. Thank goodness I'm not one of those Indians. I would argue that that type of scholarship and research is one, damaging, at a base level. Two, implicit within that framing is that if I were to overcome these inequities, is I just have to be more like the non-Nehiyô. And in that respect, it becomes like I am, it becomes colonizing. But often because the data set is often white dominated, it also becomes a site on which that it's the white supremacy. We can do better. I think that we have to start off with looking at the deficiencies or the gaps. But then it is, let's pick apart and find out why and what we can do and find different ways of doing it. So what we do in research is that we look at intergroup analysis, where we look at the oranges, but we start comparing oranges to oranges. Like we could talk about the sweetness or the bitterness. So what does that look like in research? So Teddy and a bunch of the other community members, lab members, what we wanted to do is to look at the drivers of sexual health knowledge for TwoSpirit and GBMSM, Indigenous GBMSM community members. And in this study, we compared to the responses who used those responses who used TwoSpirit to describe themselves to Indigenous individuals who did not use TwoSpirit. And what we found that there were significant differences in the drivers of sexual health knowledge between these two populations. Like, that's interesting. And then we were like, is there a difference geographically for those who are living in urban settings compared to rural and remote? And once again, we found significant differences between those two groups. From our analysis, we could offer evidence as well as wise practice guidance to inform policy and programs for those who are wanting to work or are working with Indigenous and Two-Spirit people and communities in more respectful, mindful ways. And you can kind of see that it's a different conversation. Although we're teasing out differences, we're actually making some true comparisons and we're comparing oranges to oranges. Once we go into our chat, I will send you a link to this paper. So you're more than welcome to look at this paper also. Now, the other really kind of cool thing that the lab does is we build upon and use this beautiful quote from Audre Lorde. Those of us who stand outside of the circle of society's definition of acceptable woman, those of us who have been forged in the crucibles of differences, those of us who are poor, who are lesbian, who are Black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to make our differences, it's learning how to take our differences and make them our strengths. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. We agree with that. However, because of our commitment to our Mi'kma'ki elder, Marshall, and their two-eyed seeing approach, is we take a little bit of a spin of the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So, but there are some good tools like quantitative analysis. But what we do is we take those tools and we ignore the master's house and we go down the block and we build our own house. So what does that look like in research? So how many folks here have heard of the theory of syndemics? Basically, Meryl Singer, studying HIV within the Latino community within Connecticut, came up with this theory of that syndemics is this mutual reinforcing interaction of disease and social conditions, showing okay, if we just look at violence, someone is experiencing violence, they may get a bump or increase their chances by about 10% of getting HIV. Similarly, okay, don't quote me on the 10%, just rough numbers. Someone who's experiencing substance use challenges, 10%, or adverse mental health. And so if there is an individual that is experiencing violence, substance use, and adverse mental health, it would be 10 plus 10 plus 10 equals 30. But what Singer showed was there is this reinforcing of the interaction of social conditions and disease in which that individual that is experiencing 3 or 2 or more may increase their chances of getting HIV by 95%. And so they kind of this coefficient and this multiplying effect. Now, that's cool, right? Well, I am a little harsh and critical on Meryl Singer, right? In that when I go to ceremony, we often end our prayers and we say with this Sioux expression, metakriyosin. Metakriyosin means all my relations or everything is connected and everything is related. Does that sound familiar? So rather than our paper, Drivers of Sexual Health, rather than doing a theory of syndemics, what we did was we took a theory of metakriyosin, our way. And our quantitative analysis affirms and shows how things are related and how they're connected through our analysis. And so I think that what we're trying to say here, and we're being super radical, is like, Singer, get some humility to think you came up with the theory of syndemics when we have like this expression, metakriyosin, an entire worldview. Yet you get the paper, you get the attribution, you get the academic posts. Yet we have an entire worldview. And in that respect, we're being super radical of like, been there, done that. And let's start like our tools to affirm and build our own house. So TwoSpirit and health research. When TwoSpirit data is collected in culturally safe and affirming ways, health researchers, as well as research, is given an opportunity to promote rigorous science that considers biological sex and all genders, including our conceptions within an Indigenous framework. Research conducted in this way has the potential to expand our understanding of health within a diversity framework that considers how determinants such as ethnicity, race, socioeconomic status, disability, sexual orientation, migration status, age, geography, interact with sex and or gender. By bringing these considerations into focus, we can formulate health research that impacts policy and program recommendations that are relevant and to the diversity that exists within our entire population. How we say a formal thank you to a group is Kinonaskupinina Wala. That's a formal thank you. Informally, we would just say hi, hi. And the closest expression that we have to goodbye is examaga, but examaga it really translates into that's it for now, or another way is that once our paths have crossed, they're forever intertwined and they will cross again, either in this life or in some other life. With the greatest humility and honor, I say hi, hi, or Kinonaskupinina Wala, examaga.
Thank you so much. That was phenomenal. So thank you. I know we just have a couple of minutes for questions, and if anybody has a question, please put it in the chat feature. There was one question that came in before that I wanted to ask, and it was at the very beginning when you talked about multiple genders. Has there been any discussion, or do you think that there will be an evolution to change TwoSpirit to multiple spirit to reflect that? What are your thoughts on that?
Sure, I think there is tension, right? In that the TwoSpirit is a placeholder. Like literally, we could have agreed and said, we're purple cats. Because that's an absurd example, right? It's just a placeholder for us to community organize, right? And so it shouldn't be read literally. It should just be a placeholder for us to organize, to come together. But then the conversation becomes nation specific. And it becomes like, what does Ilhamana mean for a Zuni person? And so again, it's a placeholder. And it was always meant to be a placeholder. And that's why I say there's this tension, because most people want to operationalize it like an identity, and it's not an identity. It's a community organizing tool or strategy. Now, a Yakwe, Ilhamana, a Gukwe, those are identities. Those are endpoints, and we flesh those out. And we find community and solidarity within our respective nations, but across the nations as we support one another.
Thank you.